Hi everyone, I'm Brandon and welcome back to NewsForTeens. The 27th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as COP27, took place last month in Egypt. In this video, I'll focus on the one critical outcome that's generated the most headlines. It's the decision to establish and operationalize a loss and damage fund that would help provide financial assistance to vulnerable, poor countries impacted by the effects of climate change. So what does loss and damage mean? In the context of climate change, it refers to the negative consequences and harm that can arise from events such as slow onset events that include rising sea levels, increasing temperatures and desertification, and sudden extreme weather events such as hurricanes, flooding, and heat waves, the latter of which can cause wildfires. For at least 30 years, the idea of establishing a loss and damage fund has been pressed for by small islands and other vulnerable nations. In the past, wealthy countries, including the US, have been resistant to the idea due to concerns that such a fund could open them to potential liabilities for historical contributions to emissions. Developing nations, largely from Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and South Pacific, fought for this topic to be included for the very first time on the agenda. They made it clear that it would be a moral failure if the idea was not even discussed while the summit was held on the African continent, especially in a year that has experienced multiple extreme events, from the flooding in Pakistan to the drought in East Africa. This year, developed countries at COP27 were open to these discussions, with talks extending into overtime until both the 27-nation EU and the US agreed to a loss and damage fund. Although currently limited to the EU and US, the deal includes language that could expand the donor base for the fund to include major emerging economies like China and Saudi Arabia. Although an agreement was reached to establish the fund, many details remain unclear, including how much money will end up in the fund and who will pay how much. Complicating matters, there are many ways to estimate a country's historic CO2 emissions. For example, in addition to CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and cement, one analysis by Carbon Brief further incorporates CO2 emissions from land use and forestry. If the data in light blue, representing land use and forestry, were excluded, the list of top emitters changes significantly. The current agreement calls for a committee with representatives from 24 countries to work over the next year to figure out several key areas, including who would oversee the fund, what form the fund should take, which countries and financial institutions should contribute to the fund, and how the money would be dispersed and to whom. Climate change impacts everyone, but those living in poverty are typically the hardest hit, despite being the least responsible for the crisis. Although many details are yet to be determined, many nations see the establishment of a loss and damage fund as a significant and necessary positive step towards addressing this disparity. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something new.